On a morning in March of 1968, Private Les Hiddins of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, walked 15 meters ahead of his section through primary rainforest, 4 kilometers northeast of Nui Dat Base in Phuoc Tuy province, where visibility extended exactly 4 meters in any direction, and where the previous patrol through this same area 3 days earlier had triggered a grenade trap that killed the forward scout instantly. Hiddins carried 90 pounds of equipment, including 8 water bottles, 200 rounds of ammunition, 3 days of rations, his L1A1 self-loading rifle, and the knowledge that every step might detonate a mine that his metal detector could not locate because the enemy constructed their traps from bamboo. He had been walking point for 18 months across 2 tours, and he would continue doing so for another year. Before we explain how Hiddins and soldiers like him survived walking first into every ambush, every booby trap, and every bunker system for months at a time, tell me in the comments, would you volunteer to be the man who walked 15 meters ahead of everyone else, knowing that ambush doctrine called for letting scouts pass through to hit the main body? Or would you refuse and risk your reputation? Keep watching, because what you are about to discover reveals a training system that prepared men for a nightmare that was documented in comprehensive trial reports years before the first soldier deployed. Reports that were read and understood, but that led to deployment decisions anyway. At the Jungle Training Center in Canungra, Queensland, during the months preceding deployment to South Vietnam, Australian infantry soldiers negotiated what instructors called the sneaker course, where camouflage targets appeared suddenly at ranges of 10 to 15 meters, and where the doctrine drilled into every forward scout emphasized the swift, single, accurate, standing shot, and the principle that became known throughout the training as one shot, one kill. The facility had reopened in 1954 for Malayan emergency preparation under the command of Colonel Ted Sarong, who would later become the first commander of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, and who understood from his own jungle warfare experience in New Guinea during World War II exactly what close-quarters combat demanded. Chief Instructor Lieutenant Colonel George Worf, who had earned both the Military Cross and Distinguished Service Order during campaigns in New Guinea and Borneo, supervised the development of training programs that expanded the facility to 15,826 acres with capacity for 10,000 students annually at the Vietnam War peak. The 3-week battle efficiency course became mandatory before Vietnam deployment, emphasizing individual marksmanship over volume fire, snap shooting on ranges with pop-up targets, contact drills designed to create automatic responses under stress, section independence from battalion headquarters, and small-scale patrol and ambush tactics derived directly from operations against communist insurgents in Malaya during the 1950s. The section organization taught at Canungra divided 10 personnel into 3 groups. The command and scout group, consisting of the section commander, plus 2 scouts carrying submachine guns, or L1A, 1 self-loading rifles. The gun group with 3 men operating an M60 machine gun, plus 2 additional riflemen, and the rifle group with 4 men all carrying L1A1 rifles. The forward scout's position placed him 15 to 20 meters ahead of the section, responsible for navigation through featureless jungle, threat detection before the enemy could spring ambushes, and first engagement with hostile forces encountered during patrol. Training emphasized that the forward scout should identify enemy presence through careful observation, engage with precise aimed fire, and eliminate threats with the minimum ammunition expenditure necessary, a doctrine that soldiers absorbed thoroughly during their weeks at Canungra, and that would require complete revision within days of reaching Vietnam. What the training ranges at Canungra could not replicate, despite the best efforts of instructors who genuinely believed in the doctrine they taught, was the fundamental reality that forward scouts would face in Phuoc Tuy province. The after-action reports that accumulated during the first year of operations from Nui Base stated the problem with devastating clarity. Without detracting from the need for better shooting, the concept of one shot, one kill, and the swift, single, accurate standing shot by the forward scout drilled into us all at Jungle Training Center, Canungra, and by training publications requires comment. Unfortunately, it has little relevance to the reality of the battlefield. Economy in the use of small arms ammunition seems a strange concept, given the enormous cost in money, sweat, material, and effort to gain contact with one enemy, particularly during this latter stage of the war. The visibility that training ranges provided, 15 meters of relatively clear sightlines through managed vegetation, bore no resemblance to the jungle's suffocating visual constraints, where primary rainforest allowed only 3 to 5 meters of sight, and the pop-up targets that appeared at predictable intervals could not prepare soldiers for enemy fighters who held perfect fire discipline and remained completely invisible until choosing their moment to engage. The 90-pound loads that scouts carried continuously for 3 weeks during operations, the 40°C heat with humidity approaching 100%, the chronic dehydration despite drinking maximum water-carrying capacity, the psychological burden of knowing that every step forward might trigger the mine or tripwire that eyes could not detect. None of these conditions could be adequately simulated on a training range in Queensland, no matter how realistic instructors attempted to make the experience. One commander's assessment, after extended operations, captured the gap with precision that reflected genuine frustration at the impossible demands the role created. The forward scout, 3 weeks on operation, standing slumped over with fatigue and the weight of his 90-pound pack, ammunition and water, bound by the rules of engagement, being confronted with a fleeting moving man at 50 meters. Some of the vigorous comments made in this area must be tempered by the hard reality of operations. The rules of engagement that required positive identification before firing created hesitation that training ranges had never imposed because instructors at Canungra had never penalized soldiers for engaging targets that appeared in their sectors. Yet in Vietnamese villages where civilians might be Viet Cong supporters or intimidated victims or genuinely neutral observers, the split-second decision about whether to shoot carried consequences that extended beyond individual survival to encompass strategic considerations about winning population support. Among the soldiers who cycled through Canungra in 1966 was Private Les Hiddins, born the 13th of August, 1946 in Brisbane, who had enlisted that year and who absorbed the one-shot, one-kill doctrine with the same attention and commitment as every other soldier preparing for deployment. Hiddins completed the sneaker course, learned the contact drills, practiced the swift, accurate standing shot, and departed for Vietnam confident that his training had prepared him for the role of forward scout, a confidence that the jungle would test within his first week of operations, and that months of walking point would ultimately demolish even as the fundamental skills that Canungra had provided would save his life repeatedly throughout 2 tours of duty. By the 3rd of August, 1962, 4 years before soldiers trained at Canungra began deploying in significant numbers, the first 30 Australian military advisors arrived in Saigon, forming the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, under the command of Colonel Ted Sarong, the same officer who had commanded Canungra and who understood from that experience exactly what jungle warfare demanded. These advisors operated individually or in pairs throughout entire South Vietnam, working with Army of the Republic of Vietnam units, regional forces, United States Special Forces, and Montagnard tribesmen in the Central Highlands, while some became involved in the controversial Phoenix program that targeted Viet Cong infrastructure through intelligence operations that often crossed boundaries between legitimate military targeting and assassination. The AATTV would eventually reach peak strength of 227 personnel by November 1970 and would become Australia's most decorated unit in the entire war, earning 4 Victoria Crosses plus numerous other awards for exceptional valor. Yet these 30 men who arrived in August '62 represented the modest beginning of a commitment that political decisions would expand dramatically over the following years. Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced on the 29th of April, 1965, that Australia would deploy a battalion to South Vietnam in fulfillment of ANZUS alliance obligations and in accordance with the forward defense doctrine that drove policy throughout the region, the theory being that communist expansion must be contained in Vietnam before the domino effect spread throughout Southeast Asia to threaten Australia's northern approaches. Public support ran strong initially, with approximately 64% of Australians believing that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the entire region would be overrun within years, creating strategic threats that would eventually require defending Australian territory itself rather than allied nations, thousands of kilometers distant. The 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, deployed in June 1965 to Bien Hoa, where they operated attached to the United States 173rd Airborne Brigade under American command and using American tactical methods that emphasized rapid deployment of large forces, massive firepower superiority, and body count as the primary measure of success. The decision to establish the 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province during April through June of 1966 created the conditions under which Australian tactical methods would fully develop and where forward scouts like Les Hiddins would spend months walking point through enemy-controlled territory. Brigadier O.D. Jackson commanded the initial task force composition of 2 infantry battalions, the 5th Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel John Warr and the 6th Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Colin Townsend, plus supporting elements including a squadron of the 3rd Cavalry Regiment with M113 armored personnel carriers, the 1st Field Regiment Royal Australian Artillery with 105 mm howitzers, 3 Squadron of the Special Air Service, and comprehensive engineer and logistic support. The logistic support base at Vung Tau on the coast provided port facilities and supply infrastructure, while the main combat base at Nui Dat became the operational hub from which battalions conducted continuous patrol programs throughout the province. Phuoc Tuy province offered several advantages that influenced the decision to concentrate Australian forces there, rather than dispersing them throughout South Vietnam under American command. The population of 160,000 provided sufficient density to make pacification efforts meaningful. The agricultural wealth of the region made it strategically valuable. The excellent air and sea access at Vung Tau simplified logistics, and the absence of international borders eliminated concerns about accidentally violating Cambodian or Laotian territory while pursuing enemy forces. The province had been a Viet Cong stronghold since the anti-French resistance following World War II, and 2 large Catholic migrant towns existed alongside villages that provided reliable support to communist forces during the Diem government period, creating complex civilian-military relationships that would complicate targeting decisions for forward scouts attempting to distinguish hostile fighters from intimidated villagers. The enemy forces that controlled much of Phuoc Tuy province when Australian soldiers arrived at Nui Dat in June 1966 demonstrated sophisticated organization and substantial combat power. The Viet Cong 5th Division, commanded by Senior Colonel Nguyen, the Truyen, maintained headquarters in the Mae Tao Mountains and controlled multiple subordinate formations, including the 274th Regiment, with approximately 2,000 men organized into 3 battalions designated D-800, D-265, and D-308, better trained than typical Viet Cong units and capable of executing regimental strength ambushes against Australian forces. The 275th Regiment operated as another main force unit, conducting company-to-battalion-level operations throughout the province, while the D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion represented the local force that possessed intimate terrain knowledge, maintained strong population links that assured reliable supplies from sympathetic villages, and had been assessed as capable of inflicting heavy casualties on Australian forces up to company size. Intelligence estimates indicated that communist forces could mass up to regimental strength within hours if circumstances warranted major engagement, that they possessed modern weapons, including recoilless rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, and that they had demonstrated both willingness and ability to conduct sustained operations rather than simply executing quick ambushes followed by immediate withdrawal. The terrain that awaited forward scouts combined multiple environments, each presenting distinct challenges that would test different aspects of training and endurance. Dense primary rainforest covered much of the province, where visibility contracted to 3 to 5 meters maximum, and where impenetrable undergrowth required machetes to cut trails, reducing movement to measured progress, counted in meters per hour rather than kilometers. The rubber plantations established during French colonial administration provided geometric rows of trees that offered better visibility, perhaps 20 to 30 meters between rows, but introduced complications because Vietnamese civilians worked these plantations and because Viet Cong forces used the tree rows for concealment and the straight sight lines for establishing overlapping fields of fire. Rice paddies in the lowland areas created waterlogged open ground that M113 armored personnel carriers could cross, but that left infantry completely exposed to fire at ranges measured in hundreds of meters, forcing tactical decisions about whether speed across exposed ground or slow, careful movement along covered routes presented less risk. Rivers and streams required frequent crossings where depths varied dramatically between dry season and monsoon season, where strong currents during monsoon could sweep soldiers away, and where natural choke points created obvious ambush sites that enemy forces prepared carefully. Villages scattered throughout the province presented the most complex challenge because loyalties remained unclear. Civilians might be active Viet Cong supporters providing intelligence and supplies, or intimidated victims forced to cooperate under threat, or genuinely neutral people attempting to survive between opposing forces. And the targeting decisions that fell ultimately to forward scouts who encountered villagers first required split-second assessments that training had never adequately addressed. Climate-imposed conditions as severe as enemy action throughout the year. The dry season from October through May brought temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, created severe dehydration risk despite maximum water-carrying capacity, produced water scarcity that forced rationing during extended patrols, and dried vegetation into brittle, noisy material underfoot that eliminated the stealth advantage Australian tactics depended upon. The wet season monsoon brought constant heavy rain for weeks at a time, soaked everything perpetually, including uniforms that never dried and skin that developed infections, filled boots with water that squelched with every step while feet turned white and soft with immersion, attracted leeches that attached constantly to exposed skin and worked their way through uniform fabric, turned ground into treacherous mud, especially on slopes, reduced visibility further through sheets of rain, and created hypothermia risk when cold rain combined with exhaustion, despite tropical temperatures that would seem to preclude any cold weather danger. Private Les Hiddins arrived at Nui Dat with the 6th Battalion during this initial establishment period, age 19, assigned to a rifle company, and selected as forward scout within his first weeks of operations based on his navigation skills and the alertness he demonstrated during initial patrols when the battalion began its program of continuous operations throughout the province. The section commander who selected Hiddins for the forward scout position recognized the specific combination of skills that the role demanded and that not every soldier could provide, regardless of courage or training quality. The best navigators could read terrain features accurately, use compass bearings precisely to maintain direction through featureless jungle where no landmarks existed, and develop the spatial awareness necessary to track position continuously without frequent map checks that required stopping patrol movement. Superior bushcraft allowed scouts to read signs of enemy presence, including disturbed vegetation where trails had been concealed, footprints in mud that indicated how recently hostile forces had passed, and abandoned equipment that suggested enemy strength and intentions. The highest alertness levels meant remaining vigilant for hours without the mental fatigue that caused attention to wander, maintaining focus despite exhaustion and monotony, and sustaining the observation discipline necessary to spot thin tripwires among complex vegetation. Physical fitness provided capacity to carry the 90-pound loads and maintain the patrol pace that operations demanded, while mental toughness supplied the psychological reserves to handle the constant pressure of knowing that every step forward might be the last. The selection did not reflect recklessness or death wish mentality, despite what civilians sometimes assumed when they learned that soldiers volunteered for positions that exposed them to disproportionate danger. The forward scouts who served throughout Australian battalions in Vietnam were making calculated assessments about their vulnerability and survival prospects, genuinely rational evaluations that led many to conclude their chances were actually better at the front, where they could see threats approaching, than following blindly behind someone else whose alertness might not match their own capabilities. Some units selected the most experienced soldiers for forward scout positions based on the logic that veterans possessed the judgment necessary to interpret signs and make split-second decisions, while other units assigned new arrivals to the role as a breaking-in process that exposed them immediately to maximum stress and allowed assessment of performance under pressure. Regular rotation policies spread the psychological burden across multiple soldiers within each section, acknowledging that sustained time at point position created cumulative trauma that no individual should bear exclusively for extended periods. Yet soldiers like Hiddins, who demonstrated particular aptitude for the role, found themselves regularly assigned to walk point more frequently than rotation policies might suggest. Artist Ken McFadden sketched an Aboriginal Australian soldier serving with the 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, sometime in late 1967 or early 1968, capturing an image of a full-blooded Aboriginal soldier carrying an F-1 submachine gun near Nui Dat before the Tet Offensive. McFadden described him as quite a wonderful bloke and noted that being a forward scout, that's really being up the front all the time, observing that strain was showing on his face, despite the man's evident professionalism and capability. Years later, when attempting to locate the soldier for recognition, McFadden discovered he had misplaced the paper where he had written the man's name, meaning this forward scout who served with distinction remains unidentified in official records, representing the hundreds of Indigenous Australian soldiers whose service has been inadequately documented and whose contributions to the war effort remain largely unrecognized beyond the memories of soldiers who served alongside them. What the job of forward scout actually meant on a daily operational basis extended far beyond the training that Canungra had provided or the tactical manuals had described. The position 15 to 20 meters ahead of the section placed scouts outside immediate voice contact with their commanders, requiring hand signal communication and creating isolation where decisions had to be made independently, without opportunity for consultation or confirmation from more senior personnel. The equipment load remained constant at 90 pounds regardless of exhaustion or mission duration. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, weighing 9.5 pounds when loaded, contributed only a fraction of total weight, with 200 rounds of ammunition in magazines and bandoliers adding 15 pounds, 8 to 10 water bottles during dry season operations contributing 20 to 25 pounds, 3 to 4 days of rations adding 6 to 8 pounds, poncho shelter weighing 3 pounds, first aid kit, 2 pounds, machete, 2 pounds, compass and maps and personal items, another 3 to 4 pounds, spare clothing, 5 pounds, and sometimes a claymore mine at 3.5 pounds if the scouts' loadout included responsibility for establishing perimeter defense during harbor positions. The responsibilities that accumulated on forward scouts created an observation task that approached physical impossibility given the constraints of human attention and the limitations of jungle visibility. Scouts had to maintain navigation and lead sections to objectives across terrain where distinctive features rarely existed and where small errors in compass bearing could result in missing target areas entirely or walking into prepared enemy positions. They watched continuously for tripwires that enemy forces strung at heights ranging from ankle level through waist height up to face height, using thin fishing line or vine that became virtually invisible against the visual complexity of jungle vegetation, and that connected to explosive devices or mechanical traps designed specifically to kill the lead man in any patrol. They scanned ground surfaces for signs of disturbance that might indicate buried mines, watching for unnatural patterns in soil or vegetation that suggested recent digging, yet knowing that many mines used pressure plates or tripwires positioned away from the explosive charge itself to prevent detection through visual inspection of the immediate area. They watched for punji stakes planted vertically in ground, or angled in concealed pits, or suspended from trees on bent saplings that would whip forward when released by tripwires. Stakes that had been fire-hardened to needle sharpness and often smeared with feces to cause severe infections in victims who survived the initial penetration. They maintained peripheral vision to detect movement to either side of the patrol route, watching for enemy scouts or advance elements of larger forces, attempting to distinguish between animal movement and human movement despite vegetation that obscured everything beyond a few meters, and despite the reality that Viet Cong fighters possess skills at remaining motionless that made them effectively invisible even at close range. All of this observation had to occur simultaneously while maintaining the pace that patrol schedules demanded, while navigating accurately toward objectives, while interpreting whether sounds in the jungle indicated threats or simply represented normal animal activity, while managing exhaustion that accumulated over days and weeks of continuous operations, And while making split-second decisions about whether to engage potential threats or hold fire pending positive identification as hostile forces rather than civilians. The physical impossibility of truly watching everything simultaneously meant that forward scouts developed prioritization strategies where they focused primary attention on the most likely threat vectors based on terrain and intelligence, while maintaining peripheral awareness of other possibilities. Yet this necessary compromise created gaps in observation that luck rather than skill often determined whether scouts survived when hidden threats occupied those gaps. During the fourth week of an extended patrol in 1967, when 6th Battalion operations had been extended beyond initial planning due to sustained enemy contact that prevented scheduled resupply, Private Les Hiddins experienced the convergence of every environmental challenge that forward scouts faced throughout their service in Vietnam. His section's rations had been stretched beyond their intended duration, as sustained enemy contact forced the extension of limited ration packs. Water supplies had been depleted to dangerous levels during dry season operations, when temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, and when every stream or water source required purification before drinking. His equipment load remained unchanged at 90 pounds despite the exhaustion that 4 weeks of continuous patrol had created, and he still walked 15 meters ahead of his section, watching for threats while his body began consuming its own reserves to maintain function. The physical mechanics of how extreme heat affected soldiers had been documented years earlier during Queensland trials of M113, armored personnel carriers designed to replicate Vietnam climate conditions. Trials that recorded one driver losing 5 kilograms in just 2 hours under heat-stress conditions, and forward scouts experienced identical physiological deterioration, but while carrying heavy loads and walking point and maintaining the vigilance that survival demanded. What happened during this particular extended patrol when resupply failed to arrive as scheduled demonstrated both the resourcefulness that necessity forced upon forward scouts and the beginning of what would become Hiddins' life work after the war ended. Rations that had been planned for 3 days were stretched across 5, then 6 days as enemy activity in the designated landing zone area made helicopter insertion too dangerous, and as tactical requirements prevented the section from withdrawing to base for resupply. Hiddins began supplementing official rations with local vegetation, testing plants carefully using knowledge derived partly from brief training and partly from observation of what birds and animals consumed safely, finding edible fruits and roots and leaves that indigenous peoples throughout the region had utilized for millennia, and that soldiers had never been taught to recognize or harvest. He shared his discoveries with the section, providing calories and nutrients that kept them functioning when official supplies ran out, preventing the mission failure that would have resulted from hunger forcing withdrawal before objectives had been achieved. This direct combat necessity, the requirement to forage or face starvation during extended operations, planted seeds that would grow into ethnobotany research, into authorship of the Australian Army Combat Survival Manual, published in 1987, and into the television series that would eventually make Hiddins famous as the Bush Tucker Man decades after his combat service ended. What Hiddins discovered during his first weeks conducting patrols from Nui Dat contradicted fundamental assumptions that American commanders held about how the war should be fought. And the tactical disagreement that developed between Australian and American approaches would profoundly affect how forward scouts operated and what cumulative stress they experienced throughout their service. In 1966, journalist Gerald Stone accompanied Australian patrols and subsequently described tactics that sharply differed from American operations he had observed throughout South Vietnam. The Australian battalion has been described as the safest combat force in Vietnam. It is widely felt that the Australians have shown themselves able to give chase to the guerrillas without exposing themselves to the lethal ambushes that have claimed so many American dead. Australian patrols shun jungle tracks and clearings, picking their way carefully and quietly through bamboo thickets and tangled foliage. The movement technique that Stone observed involved moving forward a few steps at a time, stopping to listen for any indication of enemy presence or unnatural silence that might indicate ambush preparation, then proceeding again in the same careful pattern that prioritized stealth and observation over speed and firepower superiority. Some patrols took as much as 9 hours to sweep a single mile of terrain, a pace that journalists found frustrating to experience, but that soldiers understood represented genuine tactical advantage because the alternative, moving quickly without adequate observation, meant walking into ambushes that killed lead elements before they could react or respond effectively. American tactical doctrine emphasized rapid deployment of large forces, concentration of combat power at decisive points, massive firepower superiority through artillery and air support, and body count as the primary measure of success that drove operational decisions and that created incentives to seek engagement, regardless of circumstances or enemy readiness. General William Westmoreland, who commanded United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, complained directly to Major General Tim Vincent, who commanded Australian Forces Vietnam, during early 1967 that the 1st Australian Task Force was not being aggressive enough and demanded that Australian forces conduct more conventional engagements at faster operational tempo to increase body count and demonstrate progress toward winning the war. Brigadier Stuart Graham, who had replaced Brigadier O.D. Jackson as task force commander in January of 1967, defended Australian tactical methods and refused to abandon the careful patrol techniques that experience and casualties had validated as more effective for the specific conditions that Vietnam presented. The impact on forward scouts of this tactical disagreement between Australian and American doctrine created a paradox that defined their experience throughout the war. Australian methods provided more time for observation, allowed scouts to stop and listen rather than maintaining continuous forward movement, created opportunities to spot tripwires and traps that faster-moving American scouts often missed, and enabled detection of ambush indicators before patrols entered kill zones where enemy forces waited with weapons trained and fingers on triggers. The result was demonstrably lower casualties per patrol and better survival rates for forward scouts who employed Australian careful movement techniques compared to American rapid deployment doctrine. Despite the clear advantages, Australian methods also meant that scouts spent more total hours at point position because patrols covered less ground per day and required longer duration to achieve the same objectives that American forces might accomplish more quickly, despite higher casualty rates. Post-war interviews with Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam fighters who had engaged both Australian and American forces throughout the war provided external validation of Australian tactical superiority that official statistics alone might not prove conclusively. The American style was to hit us, then call for planes and artillery. Our response was to break contact and disappear if we could. The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They liked to stay with us instead of calling in the planes. We were more afraid of their style. This assessment from former enemies acknowledged that Australian infantry tactics created problems that American firepower-centric methods did not, that patience and stealth in patrol techniques made Australian forces more dangerous at the small unit level where most contacts occurred, and that the careful movement that slowed operational tempo actually increased tactical effectiveness by allowing Australian soldiers to detect and engage enemy forces before they could spring ambushes or withdraw to avoid contact entirely. Historians Andrew Ross, Robert Hall, and Amy Griffin analyzed engagement statistics and concluded that Australian forces defeated Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army units 9 times out of 10 when they managed to force contact, demonstrating tactical superiority that validated the patrol techniques and fire discipline that training at Canungra had emphasized. The tactical approach that proved successful at preventing ambush casualties and achieving favorable engagement outcomes nevertheless created conditions where individual forward scouts experienced cumulative physical and environmental stress that no doctrine could fully mitigate. Because enemy forces had systematically prepared the terrain with hidden explosive threats designed specifically to kill the lead man in any patrol and to create psychological pressure that would slow operations even further or force Australian units to abandon the careful patrol methods that made them effective. According to statistics compiled by the Australian Ministry of Defence analysing casualties among all Allied forces throughout the entire Vietnam conflict from 1962 through 1972, 11% of all deaths and 15% of all wounds resulted directly from booby traps and mines. And because forward scouts encountered these hidden threats first in any patrol formation, and because Australian soldiers spent more time patrolling than rear area personnel or headquarters staff, forward scouts suffered disproportionately high casualties from devices that could not be suppressed by firepower, could not be flanked by maneuver, and frequently could not be detected until the moment of triggering them. The comprehensive catalog of booby trap variants that enemy forces employed throughout Phuoc Tuy province demonstrated both technical sophistication and intimate understanding of Australian patrol techniques. Punji stakes represented the simplest construction. Bamboo spikes fire-hardened to needle sharpness, planted vertically in ground at ankle height, among tall grass where they remained invisible until soldiers stepped directly on them, or angled into concealed pits covered with vegetation so that victims fell onto multiple spikes positioned to penetrate different parts of the body simultaneously. Some stakes were smeared with human or animal feces to ensure severe infections in victims who survived the initial penetration, while others were coated with poison derived from local plants to create additional medical complications requiring extensive treatment. Despite causing only approximately 2% of total casualties according to medical statistics, Punji stakes created psychological effects vastly disproportionate to their actual lethality, because soldiers knew that any patch of grass might conceal stakes, and that any step might result in bamboo driven through their feet or legs with accompanying infection risk that could prove fatal if untreated. Toe poppers used bullets or small artillery shells planted vertically in ground over nails positioned to strike primers, with only the tips of shells protruding above surface level and heavily camouflaged to blend with surrounding soil and vegetation. Step pressure drove shells downward onto nails with sufficient force to fire them, sending projectiles upward through feet and causing injuries specifically calibrated to maim rather than kill. Destroyed feet meant medical evacuation, extended hospitalization, and burden on combat units that had to carry wounded soldiers to extraction points while maintaining security and continuing missions. Grenade traps employed multiple ingenious variants that all shared the principle of using tripwires or pressure mechanisms to trigger explosives with devastating effect. The two-can system placed grenades with pins pulled inside metal cans positioned apart at distances calibrated for maximum fragmentation effect, with wire connecting the cans and running across patrol routes as tripwire that, when disturbed, pulled grenades from cans and released safety levers that initiated detonation sequence. Artillery shell traps represented perhaps the most devastating variants because they used American ordnance captured after airstrikes or artillery bombardments, repurposing unexploded shells by adding tripwire or pressure plate triggers and positioning them along patrol routes or near likely objectives. The detection impossibility that forward scouts faced when attempting to identify booby traps before triggering them created a tactical problem that training had never solved, and that experience only partially mitigated. Metal detectors proved useless for bamboo construction that constituted the majority of traps throughout Phuoc Tuy province, leaving visual inspection as the only reliable detection method. Yet visibility measured in mere meters made visual inspection nearly impossible, except at distances so close that triggering traps became likely before scouts could identify and avoid them. The village outside fire support base, Sandy, that soldiers named Booby Trap Veal, demonstrated the scale that trap emplacement could achieve when enemy forces had adequate time and motivation to prepare defensive positions thoroughly. The nickname emerged from reputation alone. Many a life and limb had been lost in previous attempts to enter or clear the village, and the latest attempt before major clearance operations commenced had ended with a platoon leader and radio operator blown to bits before they had even reached the village perimeter. Clearing operations required Bangalore torpedoes to blow safe lanes through minefields, multiple minesweeper teams working simultaneously, and days of methodical work during which engineers found extensive trap networks numbering in the hundreds of devices throughout a single village. Private Les Hiddins encountered booby traps throughout his first tour with 6th Battalion, spotting a tripwire during his 3rd week on operations that his section had not detected, despite careful movement and observation discipline that had become second nature to experienced soldiers. The thin fishing line stretched across a natural gap in vegetation at ankle height, positioned precisely where foot placement would naturally fall for soldiers stepping through the opening, and visible only because Hiddins happened to be watching exactly the right spot at exactly the right angle when light conditions made the line momentarily apparent against darker background. He followed the wire carefully, maintaining position until his section commander moved forward to assess the situation. Tracing the wire's path to a grenade wedged behind a tree, with pin already pulled and held in place only by the wire tension that would release the safety lever the moment wire was disturbed. The section passed through the gap safely only because Hiddins had spotted the wire that dozens of eyes had missed during their movement toward that position. Later patrols brought additional encounters with traps, found through the careful observation that Australian methods allowed, yet Hiddins also discovered after some patrols that he had walked past traps without detecting them, realized only when patrols following the same route days later found devices positioned along paths that previous patrols had used without incident, creating the unsettling knowledge that survival sometimes depended on luck rather than skill. On the morning of the 18th of August, 1966, D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, under the command of Major Harry Smith, departed Nui Dat Base on what was initially planned and briefed as a routine reconnaissance patrol mission intended to locate Viet Cong mortar firing positions that had attacked the base during the previous night and to determine the direction of enemy withdrawal routes. A mission assessed as relatively low risk and extremely unlikely to result in sustained serious combat requiring significant reinforcement. D Company consisted of 108 Australian soldiers organized into 3 rifle platoons, plus company headquarters, and 3 New Zealand artillery forward observers. 11 platoon moved in lead position, with forward scout walking 15 to 20 meters ahead as Doctrine required, watching for tripwires and movement and any indication that enemy forces remained in the area. The initial contact occurred when the scout spotted movement ahead, a small group of Viet Cong fighters, perhaps 6 to 8 men, visible briefly before they withdrew into deeper cover among the rubber trees. The platoon engaged immediately with rifle fire at the fleeting targets, and the tactical decision emerged quickly that pursuit should continue to maintain contact and prevent enemy escape. A decision that appeared entirely reasonable given the information available, but that would prove catastrophic within minutes, as the small group led them directly into prepared positions where regimental strength forces waited. As 11 platoon advanced in pursuit, fire intensified dramatically from levels consistent with 6 to 8 rifles to coordinated volleys coming from multiple positions across a wide frontage. And the platoon realized within minutes that they were engaging a much larger force whose initial appearance had been deliberate deception designed to draw Australian soldiers into the killing zone. Within 15 minutes, all platoons had moved forward to support, and D Company established hasty defensive perimeter as enemy fire revealed presence not of a company, but of forces that could only represent regimental elements. The forward observers began calling fire missions to the 105mm howitzers at Nui Dat Base, requesting continuous artillery support that would break up enemy assault formations. Monsoon rain began falling, heavy sheets that reduced visibility further and turned ground to mud. Ammunition expenditure climbed rapidly, and by mid-afternoon, company sergeants were rationing ammunition, while soldiers understood that if current consumption rates continued, the entire company would be without effective firepower within hours. At 17:55 hours, Lieutenant Adrian Roberts received orders at Nui Dat Base to deploy 3 troop of the 1st Armored Personnel Carrier Squadron, consisting of 10 M113 tracked vehicles carrying soldiers from A Company. After delays and crossing a swollen creek that created genuine drowning risk, the column encountered D445 battalion elements attempting to flank D Company position. The shock of armored vehicles appearing where none had been expected, combined with devastating firepower that 1050 caliber machine guns produced when firing simultaneously at targets measured in tens of meters, broke the enemy formation. The APCs crashed through vegetation directly into D Company defensive perimeter at approximately 1850 hours, bringing reinforcements plus fresh ammunition that transformed the tactical situation instantly. D Company survivors actually stood and cheered when they heard the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles approaching. Lieutenant Roberts reformed 9 vehicles into assault line, and the frontal assault that followed drove directly into areas where enemy forces had concentrated, and Viet Cong forces chose to break contact and withdraw into jungle darkness. The aftermath assessment on the morning of the 19th of August revealed the scale of combat that D Company had survived. Australian soldiers counted 245 Viet Cong bodies in and around the plantation, with evidence of many more removed during night withdrawal, while Australian casualties stood at 18 killed and 24 wounded. Remarkably light given the disparity yet devastating for a company of 108 soldiers. Post-war interviews with Vietnamese commanders revealed they believed they had fought an entire Australian battalion plus 2 armored squadrons rather than 1 company plus 1 troop. The Battle of Long Tan demonstrated both the effectiveness of Australian combined arms coordination and the fundamental vulnerability that forward scouts faced regardless of skill. The forward scouts who had led D Company into the Long Tan area had performed their duties correctly. They had spotted the initial enemy group, reported contact, maintained observation, Yet the visibility limitations meant that seeing 6 to 8 fighters revealed nothing about the 1,500 more positioned beyond visual range. Scouts had done everything training taught, yet still led their company into a trap that could have resulted in complete destruction. On the afternoon of the 17th of February, 1967, 6 months after Long Tan and 4 days after friendly artillery fire had killed 4 Australians, including Warrant Officer, Class 2, Jack Kirby, who had earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal at Long Tan, an Australian force from the 6th Battalion found itself facing defeat in thick jungle near Ap Mai On, approximately 2 kilometers north of Lang Phuoc Hai. Some survivors would subsequently state explicitly that Operation Bribie had been a defeat, that it was us who copped a hiding, acknowledging what official accounts would attempt to obscure. February of 1967 had already become the worst month for casualties to that point. A single week producing 16 Australians killed and 55 wounded. And Operation Bribie would account for 8 of those deaths and 27 of those wounded in a single afternoon that demonstrated how quickly situations could deteriorate when planning was hasty and intelligence underestimated enemy strength. Intelligence reports indicated that a Viet Cong company had formed tight perimeter in rainforest, assessed as withdrawing rather than prepared for engagement. The decision emerged within hours to mount quick reaction operation. Operational planning compressed into the time available. A company moved less than 200 meters from the landing zone before heavy contact erupted from well-prepared enemy positions. Within 5 minutes, 2 platoon was taking severe casualties. 1/3 of the lead platoon wounded immediately as automatic weapons engaged from positions that rifle fire could not penetrate. B Company received orders to commit to assault almost immediately, with a corporal giving orders to his section, shouting, "I'll see you blokes on the other side," in acknowledgement that he understood the casualties frontal assault would inevitably produce. The battle ground on for 4 hours at ranges measured in tens of meters, where neither side gained decisive advantage. Unlike Long Tan, where relief arrived and broke enemy will, Bribie remained stalemated. When late afternoon arrived with 30 minutes of daylight remaining, continuing assault into darkness created unacceptable risk, and B Company received orders to disengage and withdraw under continued fire. First light on the 18th revealed Viet Cong had withdrawn after holding ground long enough for command elements to escape safely. Australian losses stood at 8 killed and 27 wounded. When forces returned to the battlefield, they found the destroyed M113 at Ap Mai An marked with graffiti that Vietnamese forces had written in blood during the night. Message symbolizing all the times that scouts walked first into situations that planning had not anticipated. During May of 1968, combat-facing Australian forward scouts evolved as North Vietnamese Army regular units increasingly replaced Viet Cong guerrillas, and enemy forces demonstrated growing willingness to engage in sustained positional warfare. The Battle of Coral-Balmoral from the 12th of May through 6th of June demonstrated this evolution, 26 consecutive days of combat producing 25 killed and nearly 100 wounded, making it the bloodiest sustained engagement for Australian forces during the entire war. Forward scouts conducting daily patrols from the fire support bases faced constant contact with North Vietnamese Army patrols and ambush positions. Peak Australian commitment came during 1969, when force levels reached 7,672 combat troops, plus 552 New Zealanders. Yet, 1969 also marked the beginning of Vietnamization policy, where United States forces began transitioning combat responsibilities to South Vietnamese units. Australian government under Prime Minister John Gorton declared that commitment would not increase beyond the 7,672 already deployed, policy decision that signaled eventual withdrawal even as combat operations continued at high tempo. Private Les Hiddins' second tour occurred during this period of tactical evolution, serving with 7th Battalion from approximately 1967 through 68, and observing firsthand how enemy capabilities had improved compared to his first tour with 6th Battalion. North Vietnamese Army forces demonstrated more professional behavior than Viet Cong units, better training evident in fire discipline and tactical coordination, more sophisticated bunker systems, better camouflage, and increased use of indirect fire weapons. The forward scout role remained essentially unchanged. Hiddins still walked 15 to 20 meters ahead, still watched for tripwires and mines, still made split-second decisions about engagement, yet the enemy had evolved to become more capable and more dangerous. Hiddins applied lessons learned during first tour to survive his second deployment: foraging knowledge, careful observation techniques, patient movement discipline, and luck that no amount of competence could guarantee. Withdrawal period decisions during 1970 through 72 created bitter resentment among soldiers who continued conducting operations with progressively reduced support. The critical decision to withdraw armor before infantry proved particularly controversial. Centurion tanks departed during 1971, while infantry battalions remained conducting operations. Soldiers expressed bitterness, arguing that should have never withdrawn the armor before they pulled us out. Forward scouts continued conducting patrols throughout the withdrawal period, walking point through the same jungles where visibility remained constrained and where enemy forces still positioned traps and ambushes, knowing the war was ending but facing full danger until final withdrawal occurred. The Battle of Nui Le from the 19th through 21st of September 1971 during Operation Ivanhoe brought the last major Australian engagement in Vietnam. 4th Battalion combined with New Zealand soldiers engaging the 33rd North Vietnamese Army Regiment in 14-hour firefight on the 21st of September. Australian casualties reached 6 killed, with 5 of those deaths occurring on the 21st of September, the last Australian combat deaths in Vietnam, plus 29 wounded. Major Taylor, who commanded D Company, stated the engagement came closer to potential annihilation as any Australian subunit had since Long Tan. Forward scouts led patrols during Operation Ivanhoe, as they had led patrols throughout the previous 5 years, walking first into jungle where North Vietnamese positions waited, experiencing at the war's end what scouts had experienced since the beginning: the impossibility of detecting enemy strength at jungle ranges. The fundamental vulnerability of lead position, regardless of skill. The reality that doing everything correctly still meant walking into situations where survival depended partially on luck. The cumulative toll that 5 years of continuous operations inflicted on forward scouts defied easy quantification, because official statistics tracked total casualties without separating forward scouts as distinct category, and because psychological damage could not be measured through wound counts. Approximately 60,000 Australian personnel served in Vietnam between 1962 and 72, with 521 killed and more than 3,000 wounded. Statistics indicating that 11% of all Allied deaths and 15% of all wounds resulted from booby traps and mines provided indirect evidence of forward scout vulnerability, because scouts encountered these threats first in every patrol. The pattern across 5 years remained remarkably consistent, from Long Tan, where scouts led D Company into regimental strength force, through Bribie, where hasty planning sent forward elements into prepared positions, through Coral-Balmoral, where 26 consecutive days exhausted scouts, to Nui Le, where final battle replicated familiar pattern. The fundamental vulnerability of lead position persisted unchanged despite tactical refinements. It is interesting how you block it all out. Les Hiddins would say more than 30 years after his second tour ended, speaking finally about experiences that he and thousands of other Australian Vietnam veterans had carried silently for decades. Memories that could not be discussed during the 20 years when residual hostile public attitude toward Vietnam veterans made even acknowledging service uncomfortable. You lose friends. You see things you don't want to see. You do things you don't want to do, and do things you wish you hadn't. The simple statement captured what 18 to 24 months of walking point across 2 tours had done to him psychologically. The cumulative effect of knowing that every step might trigger death for weeks at a time, of watching continuously for threats that might not exist but could kill instantly if they did exist, and if observation failed, of making split-second decisions about whether movement ahead represented enemy fighter or civilian while bound by rules requiring positive identification, yet knowing hesitation might mean death, of seeing friends killed or maimed while questioning whether different decisions might have prevented those casualties. The cumulative trauma of forward scout service did not result from single dramatic incident that could be processed and integrated into narrative of survival and recovery, but rather from sustained exposure to conditions where hypervigilance represented rational response to genuine danger, where constant alertness for months meant psychological systems designed for short-term threat response remained activated continuously until they could not be deactivated even after threats ended, where responsibility for section survival created burden that many soldiers simply could not bear for extended periods. Knowing that every step forward might trigger mine or tripwire, that any patch of vegetation might conceal enemy fighter preparing to fire, that split-second delay in responding to threat might result in deaths throughout the section. This knowledge accumulated over weeks and months and tours until it became foundational assumption about reality that persisted decades after patrols ended and after return to Australia, where such assumptions no longer matched actual threat levels. The symptoms that manifested after the war reflected the sustained nature of forward scout trauma rather than single incident post-traumatic stress. Hypervigilance that had been essential survival skill during patrols could not be turned off when patrols ended, meaning scouts continued scanning for threats in environments where no threats existed, could not relax because relaxation had meant death during operations, maintained alertness levels appropriate for jungle combat, but exhausting and inappropriate for civilian life. Startle responses triggered by sudden noises or movements produced reactions calibrated for combat, instant movement to cover, weapon-reaching gestures that found no rifle present, adrenaline surges appropriate for firefights but disruptive in peaceful settings, creating social difficulties and reinforcing isolation, as veterans learned that their automatic responses frightened civilians who had not experienced combat. Inability to trust emerged from years of knowing enemy could be anywhere, that civilians might be Viet Cong supporters, that every situation contained potential threats that observation might miss, creating permanent suspicion and guardedness that damaged relationships and prevented the social connection that might have facilitated healing. Les Hiddins demonstrated symptoms that friends and family described as characteristic of many Vietnam veterans who had served in high-stress roles for extended periods. He was noted as socially withdrawn, camping alone more than a kilometer away from other travelers when participating in group activities, maintaining physical distance that reflected psychological need for space and control over his environment. Occasional irritability suggested emotional regulation difficulties common among trauma survivors, where minor frustrations triggered responses disproportionate to actual provocations because nervous systems remained calibrated for life-or-death stakes rather than everyday annoyances. His contemptuous attitude toward mobile phones and his choice not to wear a watch suggested rejection of civilian time structures and communication expectations, preference for living according to natural rhythms, rather than schedules imposed by society that felt arbitrary compared to survival imperatives that had governed his existence for 2 years. These were not failures of character or inability to adapt, but rather permanent alterations in how his nervous system and psychology functioned after sustained exposure to conditions where hypervigilance meant survival and where letting guard down meant death. The 20 years from 1972, when final Australian forces withdrew through the early 1990s, represented a period of silence where cultural context made discussing Vietnam service uncomfortable or impossible for many veterans. Anti-conscription protests during the war had created lasting resentment toward soldiers who served, and significant portions of Australian public blamed conscripted soldiers. 1/3 of total force had been drafted through national service lottery, rather than blaming government that had ordered the deployment. Veterans returning home received hostile reception or complete indifference rather than the victory parades and national gratitude that had greeted soldiers returning from World War I or World War II. And many learned quickly that discussing service invited criticism or discomfort rather than understanding or appreciation. Families often remained unaware of what their husbands or fathers or brothers had endured during tours. Veterans choosing silence over attempting explanations that seemed impossible to convey to people who had not experienced jungle warfare. And this silence meant that psychological wounds festered without treatment or acknowledgement for decades. The physical health consequences that accumulated from Vietnam service compounded psychological trauma and created additional barriers to recovery. Agent Orange exposure occurred when soldiers drank from streams in areas that had been sprayed with defoliant chemicals designed to remove jungle canopy and deny cover to enemy forces. Direct contact with contaminated water during patrols creating toxic exposure that would produce long-term health effects, including cancers and neurological problems and reproductive issues that manifested years or decades after service ended. The anti-malarial drug paludrin that soldiers took daily throughout their tours. Every day we would swallow the drug paludrin, since withdrawn for malaria without any idea of its long-term effects, was later withdrawn due to health concerns. But damage had accumulated during years of daily consumption. Inadequate rations during extended patrols, combined with malnutrition from eating supplies that one soldier described as 25-year-old Psi eggs that had been injected with ether at Nui Dat, created nutritional deficits that weakened systems already stressed by combat operations. Mosquito repellent distributed to soldiers was so potent it would eat away the plastic on watches. Chemical exposure whose long-term effects remained unknown, but that contributed to cumulative toxic burden that veterans carried. The result of combined psychological trauma, Agent Orange exposure, chemical toxicity from various sources, and inadequate medical care was that Vietnam infantry veterans began dying 15 to 20 years earlier than their age cohort who had not served. Statistical reality that generated the saying among veterans that once you reach 55, you are on borrowed time. The demographic data supported this belief. Soldiers who had represented in pre-Vietnam days the best physical examples of Australian manhood were dying prematurely from cancers associated with Agent Orange, from cardiovascular disease linked to untreated post-traumatic stress, from complications of injuries sustained during service but inadequately treated afterward, and from suicide rates that exceeded general population by margins that took decades for official studies to acknowledge fully. Hiddins' trajectory after military service demonstrated how combat survival skills could translate into valuable civilian contributions, even as personal struggles continued beneath surface achievements. The foraging knowledge that he had developed from necessity during that extended patrol in 1967, when rations failed, and when sustained, enemy contact prevented resupply, became foundation for ethnobotany research that he pursued privately, using his own funds during the late 1970s, studying bush survival techniques and indigenous plant knowledge throughout northern Australia. His work earned Defense Fellowship in 1981 to conduct formal research on survival in northern Australia, leading to authorship of the Australian Army Combat Survival Manual, published in 1987, as principal author, comprehensive guide that incorporated both his forward scout experience and his subsequent research into practical survival techniques that could extend operations when supply chains failed. The manual became standard Army publication taught throughout the service, demonstrating that lessons learned from combat necessity had broader military value. Recognition came through the Member of the Order of Australia, awarded in 1987 for contributions to military survival training and bush food research. He retired from regular Army as Major in 1989 after rising through commissioned ranks from the private who had walked point during 2 tours. The Bush Tucker Man television series that aired from 1988 through 1996 brought Hiddins' survival knowledge to mainstream Australian audience, millions of viewers learning about native plants and bush survival techniques through entertaining format. The show provided positive attention to Vietnam veterans after 2 decades of public neglect, demonstrating that combat experiences could produce valuable civilian skills. Yet the cheerful television persona often overlooked the forward scout service that had shaped Hiddins' life and taught him survival skills through necessity rather than academic interest. Pandanus Park represented Hiddins' most direct veteran advocacy work, established in 2001 as wilderness retreat exclusively for war veterans and located on 9 square kilometers at Coral-Balmoral Station on Cape York Peninsula, with Normanby River frontage adjoining Lakefield National Park. The location was deliberately remote and devoid of amenities of any kind, providing space where veterans could rest, relax, and meet up with old mates away from civilian life pressures, and an environment where others understood, without explanation, being necessary. The first gathering occurred in August, coinciding with Long Tan anniversary, bringing over 100 Vietnam veterans together in a setting where they could be themselves without judgment. Hiddins fought Queensland government bureaucracy for years to secure lease, eventually obtaining 15-year agreement in 2005, demonstrating persistence and commitment to helping fellow veterans access healing environment where talking was not required, but where space existed for processing trauma among people who shared similar experiences. The purpose and necessity of Pandanus Park reflected recognition that many Vietnam veterans, particularly those who served as infantrymen, suffer from mental health problems that decades of silence had not resolved, and that conventional treatment approaches often failed to address adequately. The bush retreat provided healing environment for post-traumatic stress sufferers without requiring participation in formal therapy sessions. Activities focused on fishing and bird watching and watercolor painting rather than processing trauma through structured programs. Veterans could maintain silence if they chose, could speak about experiences if they wanted, could simply exist in space where their hypervigilance and guardedness were not considered abnormal, but were instead recognized as understandable responses to impossible situations they had survived. The unnamed Aboriginal scout, whose name artist Ken McFadden lost when he misplaced the paper where he had written it, represents hundreds of other forward scouts whose service has never been adequately documented, and whose stories remain largely unknown beyond memories of soldiers who served. Alongside them, Lance Corporal Richard Tiny Parker went missing in action in November 1965 while commanding Point Section during patrol, his remains not found until 2007, when recovery team located burial site decades after his death. Symbolic of how many forward scout casualties occurred in circumstances where immediate recovery proved impossible and where soldiers simply disappeared into jungle that swallowed evidence of their final moments. Countless other forward scouts walked point for months, survived or did not survive, carried trauma silently, or died too young from Agent Orange complications or post-traumatic stress, never achieved public recognition for service that remained invisible in official histories focused on major battles and tactical outcomes rather than individual experiences of soldiers who performed impossible roles under conditions that no training could fully prepare them for. The accumulated experience of Australian forward scouts operating throughout Phuoc Tuy province and beyond from 1966 through 1972 generated comprehensive after-action documentation that explicitly challenged fundamental assumptions underlying their training, documented tactical adaptations that proved more effective than prescribed doctrine, and revealed psychological costs that military institutions would require decades to properly acknowledge. Immediate doctrine modifications following the war included formal abandonment of the one-shot, one-kill principle for forward scouts, official recognition that training at Canungra had created expectations that jungle combat reality demolished within days of reaching Vietnam. Contact drills were modified to emphasize volume fire immediately upon contact, rather than aimed shots that required identification and steady position, under conditions where neither identification nor steady position were possible at engagement ranges, measured in arm's lengths rather than hundreds of meters. Gun group positioning doctrine was revised with explicit acknowledgement that jungle terrain did not provide dominant positions from which machine guns could suppress enemy forces across wide areas. Les Hiddins' Australian Army Combat Survival Manual, published in 1987, became principal Army publication on survival techniques, incorporating lessons learned from his forward scout experience, foraging during extended patrols, and from his subsequent ethnobotany research throughout northern Australia. The manual emphasized local resource utilization and environmental adaptation, practical skills based on direct combat necessity rather than theoretical exercise, and integrated Indigenous Australian knowledge that Hiddins had learned both from Aboriginal soldiers he served with and from systematic research into traditional plant usage. The manual's adoption as standard Army publication demonstrated institutional recognition that survival skills learned in combat had broader military value. Jungle training continued through facilities at Tully that maintained Australian Army expertise in close-terrain warfare. Though as Vietnam generation retired from service, institutional memory began fading and contextual understanding of why particular tactical methods worked sometimes became lost. Statistical validation of Australian tactical methods came through comprehensive combat database analysis covering operations from 1966 through 71. Data revealing that 50% of engagements occurred at 15 meters or less, and that 80% occurred at 30 meters or less, confirming forward scout reports about visibility limitations and engagement ranges. Duration statistics showed that 75% of contacts lasted under 20 minutes, validating emphasis on immediate aggressive response. Casualty ratios validated Australian patrol methods through demonstrating lower losses per engagement, compared to American forces operating in similar terrain against similar enemies. Forward scout reports about the impossibility of positive identification at jungle ranges, about detection difficulties for booby traps constructed from bamboo, about psychological burden of sustained exposure to hidden threats. All of these documented observations were validated by statistical analysis and survivor accounts that emerged during decades following the war. Modern relevance of forward scout experience emerged clearly during Australian operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, where improvised explosive devices created threats functionally similar to Vietnam-era booby traps, hidden explosives that could not be suppressed by firepower and that killed lead elements of patrols through mechanisms that detection technology could not reliably identify before triggering. Asymmetric warfare patterns where smaller forces using guerrilla tactics engaged conventional military units replicated strategic conditions that Vietnam had presented. Pointman role continued in Iraq and Afghanistan with fundamentally unchanged requirements: walk ahead of patrol, watch for threats, lead through hostile territory, absorb first contact, demonstrating that technological advancement had not eliminated need for human scouts to expose themselves to disproportionate danger in service of mission accomplishment. The eternal truth that warfare requires someone to walk first persists regardless of technological advancement or tactical evolution. That lead role can never be made truly safe despite improvements in detection equipment or protective gear or communications capability. That burden falls disproportionately on those who perform point position, regardless of recognition or compensation systems that institutions create. Les Hiddins and others like him proved that forward scout role could be survived through combination of training and tactical doctrine and individual adaptation and luck. Yet the cost, both physical and psychological, proved enormous and permanent. Modern military continues confronting the same fundamental problem. Someone must lead patrols into potentially hostile territory. Someone absorbs first contact when enemy forces engage. Someone walks into ambushes first, because that's what lead position means, requiring institutions to honor those who perform this role, even when that recognition comes late, and even when full costs remain difficult to quantify or acknowledge. Would you volunteer to walk point knowing what you know now? The answer requires understanding that soldiers who did were not insane, as some would later characterize the role, were not possessed of death wish or reckless disregard for survival, but were instead consummate professionals who understood the job needed doing and who made genuinely rational calculations about their vulnerability. Many scouts concluded that their chances were actually better at the front, where they could see threats approaching, than following blindly behind someone else whose alertness might not match their own capabilities. Assessment that proved correct for those who survived, but that could not prevent the casualties that occurred when even perfect performance could not overcome impossible conditions or sheer bad luck. The central paradox that defines forward scout experience persists through analysis. Australian soldiers trained meticulously at Canungra for a role that training could not actually prepare them for, succeeded in keeping casualty rates lower than American forces despite walking point through the same jungles, facing the same enemies, employed careful methods that saved lives, yet still walked into regimental strength forces at Long Tan, and prepared positions at Bribie, and achieved tactical effectiveness at operational level, while creating unique burdens at individual level where scouts spent more cumulative time in most dangerous position. That scouts made rational calculations in face of genuine danger, that they accepted burden others could not or would not carry, that they willingly walked first into every ambush and every booby trap so that others might survive. These facts define their legacy more completely than any medal or memorial can capture. Les Hiddins survived 18 to 24 months walking point across 2 tours, carried trauma for 50 years, channeled combat survival skills into helping others through his survival manual and through Pandanus Park veteran retreat, and still struggles decades later with hypervigilance and social withdrawal and emotional regulation difficulties that walking point created. The unnamed Aboriginal scout, whose name was lost, represents hundreds of others whose service was never fully documented, whose burden was never properly acknowledged, whose trauma was carried silently until death. The blood-written message that Vietnamese forces left on the destroyed M113 at Ap Mai An spoke truth that official histories celebrating tactical victories would take decades to acknowledge fully. Soldiers who walked point were not superhuman heroes beyond trauma. They were professionals making genuinely rational assessments about vulnerability, while institutional failures at planning and procurement levels created burdens that became personal responsibility rather than systematic problem requiring solution before deployment. Somewhere in northern Australia today, at Pandanus Park along the Normanby River, where Hiddins fought bureaucracy for years to create space for healing, aging veterans gather who once walked point through Vietnamese jungles, who survived patrols that others did not survive, who carried psychological wounds that 50 years have not healed, finding some measure of peace in bush environment, among others who understand without words being necessary. They walked first so others could follow safely. They absorbed fire so others might live. They made rational calculations about survival and performed impossible tasks with professional competence that official recognition has never adequately acknowledged. That they survived does not diminish what it cost them, does not erase decades of hypervigilance and trauma, does not restore the friends who did not survive or repair the psychological damage that walking point for months or years inevitably created. The recognition they deserve acknowledges both their tactical effectiveness and their permanent sacrifice, both their professional competence and their human cost, both their survival and the price that survival demanded.